documentary, The God Who Speaks, proves the Bible's reliability as the source of real truth and reinforces our belief in it as our firm foundation. Watch it anytime at stream.afa.net. That's stream.afa.net.
Jenna Ellis in the morning on American Family Radio.
I love talking about the things of God because of truth and the biblical worldview.
The U.S. Constitution obligates our government to preserve and protect the rights that our founders recognize come from God, our Creator, not our government. I believe that Scripture in the Bible is very clear that God is the one that raised up each of you, and God has allowed us to be brought here to this specific moment in time.
This is Jenna Ellis in the morning.
Good morning. It is Thursday, April 17th, and a lot of litigation going on around the country that you need to be aware of. First and foremost, the DOJ announced a civil lawsuit against Maine for declining to protect integrity of women's sports. We all remember that the governor of Maine and President Trump got into a pretty heated clash where he asked her simply to enforce Title IX and protect biological women in women's sports, and she pretty snarkily said, well, we'll see you in court, and that appears to be where this is headed now. So this actually coming from hot air, it looks like Janet Mills, the governor, will get her wish. So 2 months ago, Donald Trump warned the governor of Maine he would cut off federal education funding to the state if she and the legislature didn't keep biological males out of female-only spaces. And so the DOJ has now announced that lawsuit, and Pam Bondi had a lot to say, the Attorney General, yesterday about that. And meanwhile, the UK Supreme Court has determined that men do not qualify as women under their anti-discrimination law. So it seems like the UK is maybe set on a little bit more of a reality check than the United States currently. Hopefully we'll catch up to them in that regard. Isn't that weird? But on Wednesday, the United Kingdom Supreme Court ruled that transgender women do not fit the legal definition of woman. Justice Patrick Hodge clarified that all 5 judges agreed that the terms woman and sex in the country's Equality Act, which was established in 2010, refer to a biological woman and biological sex. So are we perhaps poised to follow suit and maybe revisit Bostock eventually, hopefully? But what's exactly is going on in Maine? Let's welcome in Gerard Folletti, who is a senior counsel at the Lawfare Project. And Gerard, Governor Janet Mills getting her wish, and this seems like a pretty straightforward case that if she is not enforcing federal law, then the Trump administration can take action.
It certainly seems straightforward, and it's really mind-boggling that this is one issue that taxpayers will be funding to fight in the courts, both in Maine and in the United States, when it seems to be a clear-cut violation of Title IX that you are not giving women, girls, the protections that they're entitled to under federal law, and the governor is just refusing to act and refusing to do anything about that, requiring this now lawsuit to enforce the law.
Yeah, and there seems to be very articulable and specific harm here when you have a state that is allowing men to compete in women's sports, and then obviously with those advantages are precluding actual women from scholarships, which is money from wins, other things, and so. What does Maine potentially think that they might have as an argument to this?
I think that in part, Maine thinks that their arguments are twofold. One, that there is an expectation and the right to that a lot of federal funding non-related to Title IX, that there is an entitlement developed over the years for these funds to be used for programs that are necessary for children, whether it's, for example, school milk money or school lunch money, providing meals for underprivileged children, and that should not be tied to an argument over what Title IX is, that is a separate issue. But the biggest issue I think that Maine is arguing is that, in essence, it's arguing that Title IX simply does not apply, that it's not violating Title IX to allow people who identify as women, even though they're not, to play sports, to engage in the same competitive sports conduct as, I hate to use the word biological, but this is what we've become in America, as biological women. Maine's argument is that Title IX would also potentially encompass men who want to be women.
Which is just absurd. And again, it goes back to the courts and unfortunately the Supreme Court in the Bostock decision reading into that definition and that term and shifting that so that it's not compatible with reality and that sex no longer means sex. It doesn't mean based on biology. It can mean on feeling or affirmation or whatever anybody happens to identify with. So, we've had, this isn't the first clash on this issue, obviously. There's been a lot of litigation even coming out of West Virginia. There's been a lot of women athletes who have sued under, various titles and theories. And so ultimately, I think this will have to get up to the Supreme Court. And when we have some of these things that are outstanding, like the Bostock decision, how do you see this playing out ultimately when and possibly if, but I think just when it reaches the Supreme Court?
Well, I think what's different here is that we have the federal government weighing in to say universally that this is what Title IX means, that violating Title IX is what happens when you are allowing non-biological, again, I hate using this term, women to compete in sports. Because it's the government taking this position and not an individual, you are making that argument that it is a harm that applies to all women in the country, and that adds the gravitas of the federal government assessing and giving its interpretation of Title IX. So that makes it more compelling for courts than when it's a case of individual harm, when it's one person who was potentially denied a scholarship or a small group of people. This is why this issue is now, I think, going to make it on a fast track to the U.S. Supreme Court, because you finally have the weight of the U.S. government that's stepping in and saying this is what Title IX means, this is how we interpret it, this is the official, if you will, interpretation, and we have a legal basis for saying that this is a harm to all women in the United States, not just a speculative harm to a handful of individuals.
Yeah, and of course, with this action being initiated by Trump's DOJ, we've seen, of course, in the transition from Biden to Trump that some of the things that Biden's DOJ was pursuing, and obviously other areas, have been abandoned by the Trump administration because the DOJ is now taking an entirely different framework. So is it possible that that the left could simply outrun the clock here, or that it may maybe even unintentionally just take too long and we won't see a resolution within the next 4 years? And it's possible that another incoming administration in 2028 could kind of reverse course as well. I mean, is this something that you foresee just based on what maybe is hard to predict, but the trajectory of how these lawsuits go? Will we get an answer, do you think, from the Supreme Court within the next 4 years?
Well, while I do think that we will get an answer from the Supreme Court in the next 4 years, I'd say even in the next 2 years, the issue ultimately is not going to be resolved because we have become a country accustomed to lawfare. We have been accustomed to suing the government or suing individuals when we don't like an interpretation of the law. And for decades now, Congress and state legislatures have really stepped out of their role to clarify the law, to make the law, and have allowed these lawsuits to become commonplace. So unfortunately, unless Congress also weighs in with clarifying legislation, and unless there's, quite frankly, a social shift into back to reality, I don't think the Supreme Court will ultimately decide this issue for long. There will be other challenges, other attempts, other ways that people will try to redefine reality to suit their needs, and this is not an issue that will be definitively settled now.
Yeah, and that's such a great point, Gerard Folletti, that this is why we need Congress to act. We need to clarify the law and not just rely on the judiciary, and especially when they render unconstitutional opinions, just like what's going on right now in the midst of all of this immigration litigation. And just yesterday as well, the federal judge James Boasberg, who is now unfortunately a household name because of some of his ridiculous rulings, has now found probable cause to hold Trump in contempt over the deportation flights. And so he told the Department of Justice he's found that the government showed a willful disregard for his order. But, I'm old enough to remember in 2020, in the midst of all of the COVID litigation, for example, that even churches who were held in contempt of health orders from the government, for example, those orders had to be found constitutional before someone could be held in contempt. And this just seems to be yet another rogue judge who issues this outrageous order. and then is trying to hold the Trump administration in contempt of that order when it's still going through the appellate process. And that's exactly what Chief Justice John Roberts referred to when he said, let's wait for the appellate process. Well, it seems like Boasberg isn't waiting.
Oh, don't get me started on Boasberg. I'll quote one sentence from his opinion. One might nonetheless ask how this inquiry into compliance is able to proceed at all, given that the Supreme Court vacated the TRO, the restraining order, after the events in question. That's from his opinion. And then I'm paraphrasing his answer. Don't worry, I'll find a way. I'll find a way to find Trump in contempt, even though the restraining order was invalid to begin with. That is absolutely ridiculous. This is a judge who is, by judicial fiat, overruling the Supreme Court. He's doing something that just to find a way to hold the Trump administration in contempt, even though there's really no case now before it. This is what we've gotten to, activist judges, and I think now we can fairly call him an activist judge, who are going beyond the bounds of what they should be doing. And it's worth noting that in our history, judges have been impeached for things like this. Judges have been removed from the bench for things like this. So I think that that's what we're going to be seeing Congress do now. And while as a practicing attorney, I hate criticizing judges so openly, in this case, I think it's warranted.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when they are clearly going outside the bounds of their limited authority under Article 3 and becoming activists, and it seems like he has some kind of, personal animus or some kind of reason that he's trying so hard to even circumvent the law in order to hold the Trump administration in contempt. I mean, that is not at all anything that any judge at any level should be doing. And so speaking of impeachment, I mean, the criticism even from, within our own conservative tent is, well, if we start down that road, then we may get to where it becomes another facet of lawfare. And like we saw with the impeachment, the first and the second, frankly, of Donald Trump, then that just became a political tool to initiate lawfare instead of a check and a balance on, rogue office holders.
Oh, I agree with that criticism for the most part. I think that we should be very wary when talking about impeaching judges. I think that just opens us up to more division and more inability, if you will, to resolve disputes when we don't trust the judiciary, when we're threatening the judges with political action. However, in cases like this, where a judge is basically saying, I know that my order was invalid, but I still expected them to comply with it, that's something that you should be impeached over. That's something that disqualifies you from being on the bench. If you have the arrogance to suggest that an invalid order should be complied with anyway, and you'll hold someone in contempt for not complying with it, I mean, that's the essence of what should be impeachable. Not that you disagree with the opinion, not that you think that the judge may have gotten it wrong, but when there is such a blatant attempt to ignore reality, I think there is a role for impeachment. I think there is a role for judicial discipline. And if the courts don't step in and discipline this judge, then maybe it is an issue for impeachment.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the impeachment power exists for a purpose, and it should be wielded carefully and within the bounds of the purpose for which the founders provided that authority. It shouldn't just be merely political, even though I think the lesson that the left wanted us to learn from Trump's first impeachment was that this is quasi-political. That's what they kept arguing, that this wasn't just a legal basis and this wasn't just a facet of due process. This is because it's given to a political branch as power. Well, then this can be political for any purpose. And they basically admitted they knew they were going outside of any sort of stretch of a legal basis. But I think conservatives and Republicans, certainly including Congressman Gill, who's been advancing the articles of impeachment against Boasberg specifically, is arguing, listen, this is a legitimate factual basis for this impeachment. And if this is the precedent, we're okay with that. And I certainly agree with that line of logic. But I'm speaking with Gerard Filletti, who's senior counsel of the Lawfare Project. You can follow him on X at Gerard Filletti. I'd encourage you to do that. And speaking of the broad powers, another major case just reached the Supreme Court, and this is coming from Vox, who of course is leftist, and so I like to read their headlines to just show how they're shaping this, in the media. They say a major Trump power grab just reached the Supreme Court. The court is likely to give Trump broad, unchecked authority over the federal workforce. So this is Trump versus Wilcox, a case now pending on the Supreme Court's quote-unquote shadow docket. But it asks whether several federal agencies that are supposed to enjoy a degree of independence from the president, according to Vox, should be stripped of that independence. And so this is the latest of the cases in the Supreme Court involving what's known as the unitary executive theory, which would give presidents legal control over basically every federal job that's not part of Congress or the judiciary. And so this basically is asking the question, Gerard, I think, of whether Trump is actually the head of the executive branch, like the Constitution plainly seems to provide, because all executive authority is vested in a president of the United States, according to the Constitution in Article 2, Section 1. So what's really the problem here?
Well, I think that's exactly the problem. When you have to, this has to do with the Merit Systems Protection Board and the National Labor Relations Board. These are really the boards at the center of the dispute, and as their name suggests, these are boards that have not been favorable necessarily to the American workforce, to capitalism. These are things that have created obstacles to enforcing legal protections and have given more perhaps benefit to people than they were entitled to. So these are agencies that have been acting very much independently of executive branch direction, and Trump is trying to rein them in. At the end of the day, the issue is really simple, as you pointed out. It's whether agencies like this are actually executive branch or legislative agencies, because the way that they're treated depends very much on who is in charge of them. And if these were titularly set up as within the executive branch, as they seem to have been, then it's fairly clear-cut that the administration, that the president is in charge and can remove their heads at will, with process, of course, with the appropriate process. But it's not for Congress to step in and try to protect these people, because this is a purview, this is something that's within the province of the executive. Because there's not been clarity when these agencies were created, the U.S. Supreme Court is going to have to weigh in. And again, I think this speaks more to Congress doing its job when it writes legislation, doing it properly. And this is why we're seeing so many issues today.
Yeah, and it also speaks, I think, to the fact that a lot of these executive agencies are overbroad and probably outside the scope of federal purview anyway, just like the Department of Education has been kind of at the fore of the departments that Trump is seeking to shutter completely. But with some of these other jobs and so forth, he should have more a discretion over this. And so, this kind of raises a broader question that it seems like for a long time over the last, several decades at least, and probably even longer, we've sort of just presumed that the big bureaucracy is running on in America, and Congress and the executive through even the Republican presidents and administrations have just kind of stayed on this course. But with Trump now trying to actually do things that are against the uniparty, against the establishment, against the big bureaucracy, now suddenly there are so many legal challenges to this. And I don't see this, Gerard, as really a constitutional crisis by any stretch, as much as, some pundits are suggesting this, as much as a test on whether we will abide by the text of the Constitution, understand our original framework and limited separated powers or not.
At the end of the day, I don't think it's a constitutional crisis. It's a crisis of complacency. We've become accustomed to the way things work in Washington, D.C., and the system has not been changed. But that doesn't mean that the system is the right one or it's even the legal one. And when we do have someone like Donald Trump who comes in with a fresh view and sees how people have been captured by the system and it no longer works for the benefit of the American people, he wants to change it. That's his purview. That's what a president can do. But the establishment doesn't want to be changed. They like the power that they have. They like the way things work. They're not used to seeing it in any other way because they've gotten complacent with that view. So instead of working this out, instead of figuring out ways to give the American people what they vote for, these agencies or people who support them are looking to challenge legally the basis for reforms. And this is where we get into the ridiculous, because all of these agencies were created by Congress, well, through enabling legislation by Congress, but within the purview of the administrative branch. So these challenges now essentially are, instead of giving in to the will of the American people who want these changes, people are holding on through legal challenges. It's not a constitutional crisis. It's a matter of waking up to the reality that the Constitution was not meant to be read in the way that it's being expanded by these challenges.
Yeah, so well said. And, it's interesting always how the left, not only with lawfare, but with just the outcomes that they prefer, they use the judiciary basically to force their policy will. And I think that's in sum, basically, if we should call it Boasberging it, we should coin that term for all of this sort of judicial activism that is stepping over into policy. But that's exactly what they've done for a long time, but especially under the era of Trump. And California now is trying to do basically the same thing when they're suing Trump over tariffs. So this coming from Town Hall, California is filing a lawsuit against the Trump administration over global tariffs it imposed earlier this month. So Governor Gavin Newsom published a video on social media which he announced legal action. And so he claims that the tariffs are unlawful and wreaking chaos. So basically, just because he doesn't like the policy of the Trump administration, somehow he thinks that's a legal basis to sue?
That seems to be the case, and the legal basis that he's arguing essentially is that the president overstepped his authority under the National Emergencies Act and the IEPA, which is a legislation that gives the president the discretion and the power to act on the economy in times of a national emergency, which I think the Supreme Court and many courts over the years have upheld the president's authority to engage in this kind of conduct. And let's not forget, this is not the first time that a president has used emergency powers to rein in disparate treatment of American entities and the effect on balance of payments. Richard Nixon did this. Richard Nixon's power to do this was upheld. This is something that is not unprecedented. So the fact that Gavin Newsom does not like Donald Trump or does not like what tariffs might do to his state does not give him the power to unilaterally say, I'm going to reject this law. Yet that's what he's trying to do. He's trying to sue and invalidate a presidential power that was given to the president by Congress.
And this clearly seems, Gerard, like it should just be kicked out based on standing to say, sorry, Governor, with all due respect, you're not the president. You can determine policy in the scope of your state. And by the way, he's done that very miserably. But, a governor can't second guess the president and especially sue him over that. I mean, any more than I could if I didn't like something that the Trump administration is doing just because I disagree with the policy. Well, that doesn't override the fact that he is a duly elected president. And that's how this country runs. We vest those powers in a president of the United States to carry out policy, obviously within the bounds and the guardrails and contours of the law. But as long as he's doing that, which he clearly is, then we can't just whine about it. Basically, is what it seems like Gavin Newsom is doing, and initiate this type of litigation because bottom line, it seems very frivolous.
Well, it seems frivolous, but it's also, I know this might be a little bit of a stretch, but bear with me for one quick second. A foreign adversary launches missiles at the United States. The president prepares to respond in kind, and all of a sudden you have Gavin Newsom riding to the rescue, filing a lawsuit for an injunction saying we shouldn't defend ourselves. I mean, this is how ridiculous we've gotten with these lawsuits. You are giving, the press is playing into it. We are giving minor actors, and I hate to say it, the governor of California, in the scale of a national emergency or an economic crisis, is a minor player, is being given the opportunity to go into court and challenge a power of the president of the United States that has been duly given to him by Congress for his pride, for his benefit, for his political standing. This is how ridiculous we've gotten. And ultimately, I think the Supreme Court will throw this out. I think this will have to get to the Supreme Court. I think you're absolutely right. This is a standing issue. I think that case law has been very clear that the president does have these powers. But what this is, it's a political stunt. But it's a political stunt that's harming this country. It's giving people credence that if they don't like a law, if they don't like a rule, if they don't like something that happens, they can just sue. And that's not the answer to everything. You have to vote for people who will make changes. You have to have a national will to get things done. As much as I love the legal system and I'm a proud lawyer, you can't just walk into court because you don't like something the president said or did. And Gavin Newsom, at the base level, this is what he's doing.
Yeah, it's so well said, and it reminds me. I always use the hypothetical or maybe the analogy that the court doesn't have jurisdiction over every controversy. Just like I can't walk into a court because I don't like one of my parents' decisions on how they run the household if I'm under 18. It's like the court will say, well, too bad. Parents have authority to determine the time that they tell you that you need to be home at night. And some of those things. And so it seems like just as a court would say, sorry, we don't have any legal basis to override your parents' authority in that regard. It's the same thing here, and so hopefully this clarifies for listeners just how frivolous this is. But real quickly, Gerard, before I let you go, I also want to get your commentary on New York AG Letitia James responding as she faces an investigation of mortgage fraud. So this coming from Red State. New York Attorney General Letitia James campaigned in office for one thing and one thing only. We remember all of that, which is getting Donald Trump. And now she is being investigated, or at least referred to the DOJ for investigation on mortgage fraud. Is this lawfare against her, perhaps, or do you see this being kind of separate and distinct and maybe credible because just based on its own merits? Because one thing that conservatives do need to be very careful on is that we don't want to just say, well, it's justified when we do it, but it's lawfare when they do it.
Well, I think with Letitia James, if I remember correctly, one of the issues is that when she applied for a mortgage on a property in Virginia, she claimed that was her primary residence. Now, it's hard to believe that the Attorney General of the state of New York has a primary residence in Virginia. So there are issues here which make this referral legally appropriate, but I think we do have to be cautious. The Democrats have opened up, the far left have opened up Pandora's box by engaging in lawfare so viciously over the last 8 years, I would say, or even more than that, but especially in the last 8 years. And now there is the concern that the legal system is being abused, that you're looking at any indiscretion or any illegality, no matter how minor, and you're turning it into a bigger deal for political purposes. With Letitia James, I think the case will play out as it will. The facts will speak for themselves. I think that there is enough there for the referral, but we need to be not cheering this on as, Trump is vindicated, but we need to be careful in society not to overextend. If there is criminality, it will be dealt with, but we shouldn't be looking at this as an opportunity to settle political grievances.
Yes, exactly. So well said. Well, Gerard Faletti, I really appreciate you staying longer because we had so much to talk about this morning with all of this litigation going on around the country. We'll take a break here, and I hope that the point that everyone takes away from all of this and all of this commentary is that this is why we have to make sure that we confine our judiciary into its actual Article 3 role, and that we have principles above this moment in politics for everything. This is why we have to be grounded as conservatives. So we'll be right back with more here on Jenna Ellis in the Morning.
Well, the song says, please come to Boston. And if you are a baby boomer in particular, you remember that popular song from the 1970s? Well, we're going to Boston. We here at American Family Association and American Family Radio are going to take a tour of that great historic city and the whole surrounding area. And that's going to be in October. And we're about 3/4 of the way full with our tour there. And then, of course, we're going to Colonial Williamsburg, Jamestown, and Yorktown, as well as a tour of Washington, D.C. and George Washington's Mount Vernon. We're doing that in June and September. And so if you want information on any of our 2025 tours, go to wildmangroup.com, WILDMON group.com for all the information, and hopefully we'll see you in Boston.
These Christians, they've never read for themselves the precious resurrection story. Hey, it's Michael Woolworth with Bible League International, and we love to recount the beautiful resurrection story. It's in all four Gospels, but if you go to John 20, you read where Mary runs down to the tomb on Sunday morning, right? She's met by the angel who asks, "Why are you looking for the living among the dead? He's risen just as he said." Mary runs back to Peter and John. They run to the tomb, and then this celebration of our risen Lord ensues. Listen, Africa is the part of the world where Christianity is growing in the greatest numbers in the world, and yet as many as 9 of 10 new believers lack a Bible. They've never read for themselves the beautiful resurrection story. AFR listening family, you have the opportunity right now to bring incredible joy to Bibleless believers in Africa at $5 a Bible. $60 sends 12, $100 sends 20. It's $5 a Bible. Pray about it and call 800-YES-WORD, 800-YES-WORD. That's 800-YES-WORD, or give it sendbiblesnow.org. Sendbiblesnow.org.
Hello, Americans. I'm Todd Stern. Stand by for news and commentary next. New Hampshire parents have been staging a silent protest against young men playing on girls' athletic teams. 2 dads slapped with no trespassing orders after they wore hot pink armbands marked with 2 X's. And now a federal judge has ruled the schools have a right to ban parents wearing those armbands from all athletic events. Judge Stephen McAuliffe says the protests are demeaning and constitute harassment and intimidation to boys playing against the girls. Now, parents are wondering how the armbands are offending anybody. They also point out schools in New Hampshire fly pride flags. But Judge McAuliffe says pride flags promote inclusion. The wristbands promote exclusion. As it now stands, adults no longer have free speech in New Hampshire. Young girls no longer stand a chance of winning any sports championships against the boys. In New Hampshire, the rights of transgender people supersede everyone else's rights. I'm Todd Stearns.
Welcome back to Jenna Ellis in the Morning on American Family Radio.
Welcome back. And as Christians around the world continue to celebrate Holy Week, the Trump administration commemoration also continues as we recognize Good Friday and Resurrection Sunday this week. I hope that all of you who are listening are in a good church, that you are members of that church, and have a Good Friday and Easter Sunday morning service that you are looking forward to. I am very excited about my church, and actually on Friday, on Good Friday, we'll have a very special message about everything dealing with Easter, resurrection, and what you need to know biblically and theologically with my pastor. So I'm very much looking forward to that. So you can tune in either during the regular program, or we're also going to put it on this week's podcast on demand if you'd like to share that with friends and family. We want to make sure that everyone understands the full counsel of God. And one of the things that I love that my church does, and last year was the first time here in Florida that I attended the Good Friday and Sunday morning service, was that they started Good Friday service in the very beginning in Genesis with the creation and that historical narrative, and then original sin went all the way through, the high points of the Old Testament, and then got all the way up to the night in the garden, the crucifixion of Christ, and then ended with saying, "But Sunday is coming." And then fast forward then to Easter Sunday morning. We have a sunrise service here in Florida, which I love. Being from Colorado, we can never do that because we would always have to wear parkas. It would be like in, potentially negative degree weather. And so never had the opportunity to do that, even in spring in Colorado. So it was just absolutely beautiful. We have a sunrise service again this Easter Sunday. And then on that Sunday, then our teaching pastors, so this is, multiple pastors, our teaching pastors then participate in the rest of the story and what we know from the truth of the resurrection. of Christ our Savior, and then the establishment of the church age and the New Testament church, and then all the way up to the present era, and then even going beyond that into what we know about the end of all things and the completion of the story. And this is what I love about God as an author. There are so many names of God and so many beautiful expressions of the names of God, but being the author of creation and history, literally meaning his story. When we talk about God being an author, we know that he told us how time began and how he created literally. And then we know what is coming. And the author always finishes the story. God writes his story. And one of the things that I love about journalism, about media, is saying that what we're doing is recording God's movements throughout history. When we talk about things and current events and what's going on, we're talking ultimately about God's movements throughout history, his protections on this country, on our lives as Christians. And so we need to look forward to Easter Sunday in the grand scope of his story and things and blessings and promises that are yet to come. So make sure to tune in tomorrow for Good Friday, and also on the podcast on demand at afr.net. You can click that podcast link, and we'll be right back with more here on Jenna Ellis in the Morning.
Hello, I'm Sam Rohr, president of the American Pastors Network, a growing national network of pastors committed to the authority of Scripture and preaching the whole counsel of God. We believe biblical obedience is the foundation for revival, and impacting our culture for Christ is our duty. For too long, the pulpits of America have been silent on the important issues such as marriage and family and assault on our liberty. Join us in the battle for truth on Stand in the Gap weekend, Sunday evenings at 6 p.m. on American Family Radio, and visit us at AmericanPastorsNetwork.org.
Fostering and adoption is not a Band-Aid for infertility.
Nope,
it is a calling, and God can change the desire of your heart and make that so rewarding. It's the most beautiful, selfless thing. It's pure religion, but it's not a fix to I desire biological child. God has to deal with that in your heart separately.
Hannah's Heart, encouraging couples through infertility and miscarriage. Saturdays, 4 a.m. Central on AFR or on the AFR app.
Leave your offering there before the altar and go. First, be reconciled to your brother, and then come and present your offering. My name is Abraham Hamilton III, and this is the Hamilton Minute. Jesus focused authentic Christ following to heart evaluation, in addition to conduct assessment in the Sermon on the Mount. He also highlighted the reality that worshiping God includes our relationships with brothers and sisters in Christ. He described a worshiper en route to make an offering unto the Lord, who remembered that he had a frayed relationship with a brother. Christ commanded him to render a whole offering by first being reconciled to the brother, then continue in worship by making an offering. Love for God is displayed in our relationships in his body.
Listen each weekday from 5 to 6 p.m. Central for the Hamilton Corner, or visit the podcast page at afr.net for more from Abraham Hamilton III, Public Policy Analyst for the American Family Association.
The following is not an actor, but a real-life story from Trinity Debt Management.
I'm Claire from Trinity Debt Management. I'm a counselor, and the reason that I love working for Trinity is because I get to help folks with one of the hardest problems a family can face, and that's financial difficulties. In this day and age, everything is going up. You have higher utilities, higher grocery bills, higher fuel, and those credit card interest rates have gone up as well. We can help you with that. We can help you get lower interest rates, lower monthly payments. In just a few minutes, we put together a plan that gets you out of debt and keeps you out of debt. I love my job. It's a great program and a very smart way to find debt relief.
If credit card debt has you down, call Trinity at 1-800-788-1813.
I'm Claire, a Trinity counselor. Call me and become debt-free for keeps.
1-800-788-1813.
Welcome back to Jenna Ellis in the Morning on American Family Radio.
Welcome back. Well, in kind of a bizarre growing story, a third top Pentagon aide is now on administrative leave over the leaks probe. This coming from Fox News. So Colin Carroll, Chief of Staff to Deputy Defense Secretary Stephen Feinberg, was escorted out of the building on Wednesday. And this is in 2 days as part of the probe into media leaks. And so a defense official confirmed that Mr. Carroll had been placed on administrative leave, and this was after last month the Department of Defense, or DoD, announced it would launch a probe into the, quote, recent unauthorized disclosures of national security information, unquote, and might employ the use of polygraphs to determine the source of the leaks. So let's welcome in Scott Eulinger, who is a former CIA officer. And Scott, let's kind of put this in context here. These media leaks, is this part of the Signal group chat allegations, or is this something different?
This actually, good morning, Jenna. This actually seems to be different than the Signal chat, which basically involved, I think, the Chief of Staff or the Deputy to Michael Waltz, the National Security Advisor. So this is something different. What I don't know, and maybe you do, is were these individuals holdovers from the Biden administration? That is something I haven't been able to determine yet. But it does. But whether that's true or not, it points out that there is still a problem. We saw this problem was rampant during the first Trump. Is basically the vetting of personnel, primarily even support personnel around choices such as Secretary of Defense, National Security Advisor. It still seems that this is a problem, although I have to admit it's not as bad a problem as it was during the first administration.
Yeah, at least so far. And that's a really good question. I don't know with confidence enough to say that I know that these are not holdovers from the Biden administration, but just based on what I've seen in reports, my best guess is that they are not, just based on who these individuals are and the positions they've held in the past. But certainly any holdovers from the Biden administration, like what we saw in the first term of Trump with the holdovers from the Obama administration, those need to definitely be rooted out, especially if they are intentionally acting contrary to now the current administration and their priorities. But with unauthorized disclosures of national security information and basically leaking to the media what's going on in the Pentagon, I mean, that seems like a very serious offense. This isn't just a matter of losing your job. I mean, could there potentially be some other type of legal consequences?
I mean, there very well could be. It does seem like this. The administration is taking this seriously, and they talked about like basically using polygraphs to try to find more information about this. Polygraphs may or may not be part of the original vetting process, like it's standard in the CIA where I was. I mean, I've gone through a number of polygraphs, but I'm not sure if it extends to people who are in senior staff positions in the Pentagon. But hopefully they will do something about this concretely, that actual punishment instead of just removal. I actually have a tendency to think that they may actually be holdovers from the Biden administration. And people might ask, how is that possible? And because I'm looking at it from the positions, like you just mentioned that the third guy recently removed is a chief of staff to an undersecretary of defense. And the problem, I suppose, this is what people in the administration would say. I don't know if I agree with it. Is that when you get to these senior support positions for, like, let's say, politically appointed individuals, these people are kind of creatures of the swamp, or they have functioned in the swamp in Washington for a long time, and that's how they know the ins and outs of being a chief of staff, like supporting somebody who has a political position. For example, I have a lot of experience in intelligence and national security matters, but I don't have a lot of experience in, let's say, chief of staff functions. And so perhaps this weak link has caused the administration to say, okay, look, we need people who know the ins and outs of Washington, and so they're tending to pick people who are already Washington insiders. And when you do that, you are playing with fire, as we're seeing.
Yeah, that is such a great point, Scott Eulinger, that even if these aren't holdovers from the Biden administration, if they're still part of the Washington swamp and have been around that swamp for a really long time, and that's why they're chosen, then often, it's not always the case, but often they have been playing the political DC insider game for so long that then they come to the job in the Trump administration, and in this case, the Pentagon, with that same mindset. And that is exactly what got the Trump administration in trouble. I'm not talking about like legal trouble, but just in terms of the trouble that it had with its own personnel in the first term, and why Trump should be, I think, relying more on people either he knows personally or outsiders. I mean, even like Pete Hegseth, the defense secretary himself. I mean, when he was going through his confirmation hearings, of course, you recall, Scott, and our listeners do, that the mainstream media and the leftists were just saying, oh, he's a Fox News host, as if that was his only credential. But I think part of the reason that Trump chose him is not only that he knows him personally and has for a while, but he's a political outsider. He wasn't part of the DC swamp, and so won't come in with that type of mindset and pressure, but will come in just wanting to serve the president. And so when we're talking about these three, you mentioned their senior roles, and just so listeners are aware, we're talking about Dan Caldwell, who's a senior advisor, Darren Selnick, Deputy Chief of Staff, and Colin Carroll, Chief of Staff to the Deputy Secretary. Those are the roles and the administrative roles and the individuals who were escorted out of the Pentagon as now they are doing this more wide-scale investigation. And, the question should be then, as you mentioned, the polygraphs, all of this other stuff, why weren't they as heavily vetted up front? Why is it only after 4 months now or so in the Trump administration that we're only escorting them out after leaks occurred instead of maybe not hiring them in the first place?
Right. I mean, well, maybe, for example, like I said, I'm not sure if they require a polygraph, but for example, they may have already passed a national security polygraph, which is basically saying, are you a spy for a foreign country? But because of their political inclinations or who they voted for or some of their opinions, which basically the polygraph might not cover, they may have decided for the first time, okay, I'm going to leak this stuff because I just don't like what's going on. And so, another thing is that, they may not be giving these widespread screening to these subordinates, these staff members to politically appointed positions, because they simply need to fill them because, there are bad guys out there and the Pentagon needs to be able to react to that. So they need these people now. They can't wait. But on the other hand, I do know, I'm obviously a former CIA station chief with a lot of experience. Granted, it's been several years since I've been in the CIA, but I do know other CIA officers who are much higher ranked than me and much more experienced. And to my knowledge, they haven't received any phone calls. So what I'm saying is when I see things like this, I tend to also say, okay, well, how come I haven't got my phone call? In other words, I don't buy we can't find anyone else, because I know people who may require some extra training for staff functions, but have the substantive knowledge to be able to fill positions in counterterrorism, in intel collection against Russia or whatever. So that tends to be, I think, it's probably the reaction of some other of my colleagues is that, okay, I understand that that's bad, but how come I haven't received a phone call yet?
Right, and that begs the question then, who's making these personnel decisions? Because we know that somebody like a Pete Hegseth isn't going to borrow from the swamp that he hasn't really been part of. And so is this something that maybe is a lapse in the Trump administration from, Trump obviously appointing his cabinet, but then the secretaries in these positions sort of staffing out, and maybe aren't entrusting the right individuals with these types of staffing protocols?
Right. I mean, it's just difficult. But the good thing is that I think that the trend is in the right direction. Like, in other words, there's always going to be some missteps. I mean, no one is perfect. I understand that. So maybe they're going to learn by this, by polygraphing them, and by perhaps some punishment for these individuals, because we're obviously Americans are waiting for a lot of people to be going to jail, et cetera. Hopefully we'll resolve this problem. But like I said, to understand, like, let's say Hegseth gets in there and he may pick one or two advisors that he personally knows, but probably because he is an outsider, he'll be able to bring some team members in, but other ones are going to be on the recommendation of maybe somebody who already works in the Pentagon. Let's say it's a Republican who didn't work for Obama and Biden, and he's going to say, okay, bring this guy in. But sometimes there's fault there. There's a mistake made. Like, for example, with Waltz, the National Security Advisor, and the stupid non-event about the signal conversations. I think it was his deputy director, like, basically that is suspect. And I don't know if he was removed or not, but people pointed out that although he is nominally a Republican, he worked for Perkins and Coie, which I think is the law firm that was associated with the Russiagate scandal. So even though nominally Republican, he's working at a firm that, by virtue of working at that firm, I would regard him as highly suspect and even wouldn't have considered him for the role. But yet they, in fact, did that. And hopefully, they're going to be doing that a little bit less.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And I'm reading over a little bit more in depth into a couple of these pieces. And at least coming from Fox News, they're reporting that at least Selnick and Caldwell, two of these individuals that were escorted out of the Pentagon, worked at Concerned Veterans for America, which is an advocacy group once led by Hegseth. So it's possible that he knew them personally and brought them in. And that kind of creates a little bit more even of a wrinkle of, somebody, if he knew them personally, brought them in, and now they're not trustworthy.
That is actually troubling. So I agree with you. Reading between the lines, it sounds like he knew them somewhat, and that maybe even the veterans organization that Hegseth worked for. So that's right. That shows you the difficulty of doing this. We have to remember that leaks to the press are incredibly common and have been my entire lifetime. I don't care who is president. But especially now, like, for instance, with the tariffs and stuff, Trump was able to really get a lot of bang for the buck because there have been no leaks economically, and very few leaks with politics or the military. So it's important to try to keep a tight ship, but it's rather troubling that that Hegseth, probably knew these guys, but obviously the vetting was incomplete. You wonder what were the motivations of these individuals, and maybe we'll find out a little bit more about that as an investigation continues.
Yeah, and if there are any other individuals that will be escorted out, because this is, kind of an ongoing breaking story with the third announced just yesterday. So Scott Eulinger, and my special guest this morning is a former CIA officer. Where should the DOD specifically, but the Trump administration as a whole, with seeing this, obviously we don't want this type of scenario replicated in any other executive agency. Where should they go from here? And is it wise perhaps to, for other agencies to ensure that they maybe go back and vet even their current employees a little more thoroughly in light of this story?
I think they do need to do that, but I think another thing they need to do is maybe move. I think the administration needs to move a little bit beyond its comfort zone and really try to get people in who are not part of any Washington establishment, Republican or Democrat. Now, of course, the difficulty or the discomfort with that is that the people from outside, who are in the military and that live in Cincinnati now or live in Houston, they're not going to know. There's going to be a little bit of a learning curve for these individuals as they learn their jobs maybe more than would be required by a Washington insider. But by doing so, this is in keeping, I think, with Trump's campaign promises. And you just need that new blood, those people from outside. And accept the fact that maybe for a couple of weeks there's going to be a learning curve, and that office is not going to be operating at 100% efficiency. But at the same time, once it is operating, you won't have to worry about loyalty, and you'll have people who won't be leaking. So I think that that's one thing that the administration needs to do, a little bit more outreach to experts and specialists who are outside of Washington. Even for relatively support positions to principals, because that's who we're talking about now. These three people were not appointed by Congress or anything like that. They were supposedly experts that were picked to support political appointees.
Yeah, absolutely. What great commentary and advice. And I hope that Trump and also his secretaries and their deputies are relying on even outside advisors that they can in order to circumvent some of these problems and cut it off right at the start. I mean, we're right at the beginning of the Trump administration, so we got a long way to go. But Scott Eulinger, always appreciate your time this morning. Thanks so much. And we're already out of time this morning. But as always, you can reach me, Jenna, at afr.net. Make sure you are tuning in tomorrow for our very special Good Friday program, and it'll also be on the podcast on demand.
The views and opinions expressed in this broadcast may not necessarily